Hi everyone, my name is Nisha and this is episode 2 on Money Talks. So today I want to talk about the biggest economic bust since the Great Depression in 1929, the Great Recession of 2008. And there are so many layers to unpack here because there isn't just one definitive culprit that caused this big of a calamity. So let's just get into it. Okay, so I just want to preface by saying that I think every one of you should watch The Big Short. And not just because of Brad Pitt and Ryan Gosling and Christian Bale, who are all in the cast, by the way, but because it is super informative about the recession and it explains what exactly went wrong in a more dramatized and entertaining way. But I highly suggest that you watch it. So I want to start off with a little story. Let's rewind all the way back to 1844. Three brothers, Henry, Emmanuel, and Mayer Lehman, and keep in mind their last name, Lehman, established a dry goods store in Alabama, and they only accepted cotton as the form of payment. So this propelled them to enter their company into the cotton trade that was so lucrative in the late 1800s. So the business began picking up speed, and the scope of the company shifted from cotton trading to commodities trading. And then they branched off to brokerage services, and then investment banking activity started not long after that because they figured that being like the intermediary was more profitable than actually selling the goods. And to be frank, the company flourished. It grew into a very respectable name, and it was even well regarded across seas. So over time, the firm survived a string of obstacles, like the railroad bankruptcies in the late 1800s, the Great Depression, not one, but two world wars, the stock market crash of 1987, and the dot-com bubble in 2001. They were still alive and kicking even after all of this, like even more profitable than most other banks. In 2007, before the crash, Lehman Brothers reported a whopping $4.2 billion in net income and $60 billion in net revenue. I mean, if they could survive all of that, what couldn't they survive? Well, the answer, the collapse of the US housing market, which brought Lehman Brothers to its knees in one fell swoop. Well, specifically, the craze over subprime mortgages. Okay, so the whole debacle started in 1999 when the Glass-Steagall Act got partially repealed. So the Glass-Steagall Act was originally passed after the Great Depression in order to separate commercial banks, which oversaw everyday financial transactions, from investment banks, which typically handled the more riskier stuff like stocks, initial public offerings, and mergers and acquisitions. And it is crucial to keep these two banks separate so that commercial banks don't get risky with customer deposits. And this is exactly what the Glass-Steagall Act prevented. However, in 1999, it got repealed by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, or the GLBA, which is the acronym. And it allowed commercial banks to engage in a wider range of riskier services and transactions, and it allowed banks to grow so big with little to no financial regulations. In fact, too big to fail. Okay, so I just want to add that this repeal was only a minor incident that influenced the recession because there were many other straws that broke the camel's back. But yeah, this was just the beginning. The real heavy hitters that caused the economy to collapse were predatory mortgage lending practices, the creation of financial derivatives, overconfidence in the housing market, and ultimately Wall Street greed. Okay, so let's fast forward 2 years. At the wake of the dot-com bust, which was just a stock market crash due to overvalued tech companies, which just solidifies my philosophy of not buying stocks that one is not familiar with. So, moving on, as a response to the crash, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates to levels as low as 1% to, stimulate the economy and keep the economy strong. In addition, there was an abundance of cheap credit, which made borrowing money really, really easy for banks. So these banks went crazy with leverage, which just means debt that is used to amplify returns. So yeah, leverage basically turns good deals into great deals, and this is how banks made most of their money. So general investors saw this and they decided that they wanted a piece of the action. So Wall Street came up with a pretty bright idea. What if they could connect investors to homeowners through their mortgages? And connect they did using the creation of a mortgage-backed security. Okay, so to keep it short, a mortgage broker connects a family in the market for a house with a mortgage lender and a mortgage. making a really, really fat commission. The family then buys a house, and the lender sells the mortgage to an investment bank, who then buys a bunch of these mortgages and packages them up into a CDO, or a collateralized debt obligation, which is just basically a bunch of mortgage-backed securities in addition to like other forms of debt piled into like a pool. He then splices the CDO into three parts: safe, moderately safe, and riskies, which were then rated by the different credit rating agencies like Moody's, Fitch's, and S&P. So these mortgages were rated based on how likely the mortgage owner would pay back their mortgage. And the higher the rating is, the less likely that the mortgage owner would default on their mortgage. So AAA is the highest rating on a pool of mortgages, and it kind of just like descends from there. And the investors didn't really care if a homeowner defaults on their mortgage because he can just sell his security to the next buyer and so forth. It was kind of like playing hot potato with like a bomb. And then using the money from investors, the investment banker then repays the loans. So here is where it gets a little interesting. So these investors happen to love these mortgages so much that they wanted more. However, when the investment bankers consulted with the lenders that gave the mortgages and the brokers that sell the houses, there weren't any more qualified people left to sell these houses to. So, okay, for some background, mortgage lending is a very meticulous endeavor. Okay, these lenders can't just sell to anyone. The people that want a mortgage would need to have a good credit history, an optimal credit score, or like a FICA score, FICA, I don't know, and then a stable income corresponding to the house that they want to purchase. So if they didn't have the three factors, well, they are out of luck. However, since these investment bankers paid a hefty fee for these mortgages, it gives a financial incentive for these lenders to lend mortgages to people who didn't meet the requirements. These are called ninja loans, or no job, no income loans, or subprime mortgages, which are mortgages that are not lended to prime candidates. Lenders were handing out loans left and right. They were like, you get a loan, and you get a loan, and you get a loan. So if the people default on paying back their mortgage, well, the banks can just take the house as collateral and then sell it for a hefty price, and then, all is well and good, right? But that is where all of the destruction begins. Because what the unsuspecting buyers failed to realize was that it wasn't this simple, because there was always a catch. The first thing that you learn in economics is that there is no such thing as a free lunch. No. These subprime mortgages that were being lended were borderline predatory, and they were called balloon or adjustable rate mortgages. And this just means that initially the interest rates on a loan might not seem like much, but as time progresses, the interest rate adjusts periodically. So these type of loans were being lended to poor people that couldn't even speak English and who didn't even understand the nature of the loan. And these lenders took advantage of that just so they could secure a fatter paycheck. Okay, so let's fast forward a couple months, okay? Not surprisingly, someone defaults on their mortgage, but it's okay because the lender can just take control of their house and sell it later. However, more and more people start to default on their mortgages and the lender sees more houses. At this point, there is more supply than there is demand. So house prices don't rise. In fact, they tank. So this creates a very interesting situation for the homeowners still paying back their mortgages. When everyone in a community defaults on their mortgage, the value of the houses plummet in that neighborhood. As for the people still paying back their mortgages, the value of their house also starts to go down. And they may start to wonder, if my house only costs $100K right now, why am I paying back a $400K mortgage? And then they decide that there is no point in paying back their mortgage, so they just walk away, even though they are capable of paying it back. In addition, the big banks would bribe the credit rating agencies that I mentioned before to rate their CDOs as AAA, even if it was filled with absolute shit. If the credit rating agencies wouldn't comply, the big banks would just go on to the next agency to rate their pool. So it basically gives a financial incentive to the credit rating agencies to lie about their ratings so that they could secure bigger paychecks. And even if the highest rated AAA CDOs were actually filled with CCC mortgages, no one would know. And as you could probably tell, this is grounds for disaster, because if the highest rated CDOs collapse, then it's game over. At this point, default rates in the country skyrocket. Now, the CDOs are basically worthless since no one is paying back their mortgages, so investors were no longer in the market to buy these securities. Now, this is when all of this shit hits the fan, because the investment banker borrowed millions, if not billions of dollars, which he can't repay since he doesn't have the funds. Since, the CDOs are basically failing. Okay, so basically the whole financial system collapses because broker can't get his commission on the mortgage, lenders have no one to sell to, and investment banks, well, they are basically buried in debt and with no way to get rid of it. This was when all the bankruptcy started rolling in, and that wasn't it, believe it or not. The CDOs were basically garbage, so the investors also lost an exorbitant amount of money. So remember the little dissertation I gave of Lehman Brothers in the beginning of this episode? Well, this was exactly what happened to them. They were drowning in leverage when the bubble burst because they underwrote more mortgage-backed securities than any other financial institution. In one day, its share price dropped by almost 50%. But that's not all, especially with the creation of a credit default swap. So a credit default swap is basically insurance on a collateralized debt obligation, and it's like a form of hedging. Which is basically just a risk management strategy. For example, if I have like 5 shares of Apple and, I were to believe that in the future the share price of Apple would tank, then I would buy insurance on the shares that I bought. Like, it's a strategy to kind of like offset the losses. So investors could purchase a credit default swap if they were to believe that their investment were to default in the future. However, with the creation of derivatives, no, not the calculus kind, but these are basically securities that derive its value from an underlying asset. And this allowed people to bet on anything that they wanted, even the weather. So it allowed people who did not own a CDO or a collateralized debt obligation to purchase a credit default swap. So basically, it's a method of shorting or betting against the market. Anyone who thought the CDOs would fail would buy a credit default swap and earn money off of it defaulting. And you know what the worst part is? These big banks, not to name names, but I don't care. Goldman Sachs bought these credit default swaps on the same CDOs that they were selling. This means that they knew their CDOs would fail, yet they still continued to sell them for a profit to unsuspecting investors. And they still profited from their CDOs failing since they bought insurance. How messed up is that? And this just goes to show that the big banks don't really care about us. They only care about how big their pockets can get. How immoral is that? These financial institutions that are supposed to serve the people of America, the backbone of our nation, not their executives. And I think it's pretty befitting to talk about AIG. AIG was the insurance company selling all of these credit default swaps, and they were making bank because the chances of having to pay out on their insurance seemed very, very unlikely. Because, these collateralized debt obligations would never fail, right? Like, not in a million years. So there was nothing to worry about. Well, wrong, because foreclosures of homes skyrocketed in 2007, and AIG couldn't cover what it promised to. In addition, it didn't help that a couple groups decided to short the market by purchasing a whole bunch of credit default swaps. The most prominent figure being Michael Burry, who predicted the recession and decided he was going to get rich off of it. No hate to him, don't hate the player, hate the game. So AIG had to pay them up as well. So at the end, AIG incurred more than $25 billion in losses. But guess what? The government steps in and saves the day since AIG was in danger of a foreclosure. And you know why? Because AIG was deemed too big to fail. And this was a reason why the government swooped in to save AIG, but left Lehman Brothers for dead. Because, some financial institutions and banks are so integral in the economy that it would be disastrous if they were to collapse, and it would send shockwaves to every single other industry, leading to pervasive financial destruction. So basically, if AIG were to fail, the entire economy would follow suit. Okay, circling back to Lehman Brothers, the reason that they collapsed was because of a couple reasons. First of all, they were jacked to the tits in leverage, and yes, this is a reference to The Big Short. This basically just means that they were over-leveraged and they took on way too much debt because they were too confident that their investment in the mortgage securities or the CDOs would never fail. And you know what? The day before the markets tanked, they knew. They knew that their investments were a pile of shit due to some like smart ass rocket scientist quant who predicted the market downturn. But as a result, they tried to offload their investments to buyers, but no one would buy because it was too little and too late. Okay, so let's zoom out from Wall Street and zoom into Main Street. Unemployment soared. Okay, to really understand unemployment, we have to like define the scope of it. Take children, for example, okay? Most are not employed. But then again, they are children. So they aren't actively looking for a job because, in most cases, the parents provide. However, in this case, people who were actively searching for a job couldn't find jobs. The unemployment rate doubled to more than 10%. This means that 1 in 10 adults were out of a job. And for every percentage that unemployment increases, 40,000 Americans die. And even if someone were to find a job, the wages decreased by more than 17.5%. People weren't spending, and the economy took a toll because of it. The GDP fell by more than 4%. And to put that into perspective, it was the biggest decline since the Great Depression in 1929. People couldn't afford to live anymore. The recession put approximately 700,000 Americans on the streets. And it wasn't a rare occurrence to see rows and rows of tents with entire families living in them. In fact, it was the norm. And you know what happened to the big financial institutions that caused this mess in the first place? Well, in the years that followed, hundreds of bankers and rating agencies executives went to jail. The SEC was under mass scrutiny with many overall efforts. Congress was forced to break up the big banks and regulate the mortgage and derivative market. Nope, just kidding. Haha, you thought. Well, they all got away scot-free with absolutely no consequences. The banks took the money that the American people gave them and paid themselves huge bonuses. And when all was said and done, only one single banker went to jail. A poor schmuck from Credit Suisse. He hit a few $1 billion in mortgage losses, what the big banks did on a good day. And you know what else happened? Since all the big banks were on the brink of collapse, the government stepped in and bailed all of them out. And you know who was paying for all of these bailouts? Yeah, that's right, us Americans. The same Americans who lost their jobs were living on the side of the street. We paid for these billionaires to keep their salaries, and you know what they did with their money? Lobbied to Congress to kill big reform. Because at the end of the day, the poorest of people always pay the most. And what do the rich people do? Nothing. Because saints don't live in Park Avenue. Okay, so this recession doesn't just highlight one of the most disastrous events in American history, but it also showcases the extremities of Wall Street greed. This collapse was driven by corruption of our current exploitative system that only prioritizes profits. It shows like the big giants like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, the ones who were supposed to serve us, weren't really looking out for the public, but rather their executives. And nothing really changed. There were some efforts made by Obama and the Federal Reserve, like the launching of the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, and quantitative easing in order to stimulate the economy, but it never really addressed the underlying issue of our system, which was built on systemic greed, reckless speculation, and the exploitation of everyday Americans. So thank you for watching this episode of Money Talks. Stay tuned for the next one.